"If you marry him, you're no longer my daughter." Those were the exact words my father, Richard Carter, a man worth more than most companies, said to me on the day I walked down the aisle. He didn't whisper them. He didn't pull me aside. He said them loud enough for the guests in the front rows to hear, his voice calm, controlled, like he was announcing a business decision instead of tearing his own family apart. And then, just like that, he turned his back on me and walked out of my wedding. I remember the silence that followed more than anything. The kind of silence that presses against your chest. People avoided eye contact. A few whispered. Some looked at me with pity, others with quiet judgment. Because to them, this wasn't just a father disowning his daughter. This was a billionaire CEO rejecting a man he deemed beneath his name. I stood there in my dress, feeling the weight of everything I was about to lose, my home, my security, my last connection to the life I had always known. And yet, when I looked at Daniel, he didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look angry. He simply reached for my hand, steady and warm, like none of it mattered. Like we had already won something no one else could see. We finished the ceremony.
No dramatic speeches.
No scene. Just quiet vows spoken in a room that suddenly felt too large and too cold. By the end of that night, my father had cut off every account, every card, every safety net I had ever relied on. Within 48 hours, I went from living in a penthouse overlooking Manhattan to a one-bedroom apartment that barely fit our bed and a small kitchen table. I told myself it was temporary. That love would be enough. And for a while, it was. Daniel never complained. Not once. He fixed things when they broke, cooked dinner when I was too tired to think, and somehow made that tiny space feel more like home than the place I had grown up in. But there were moments, small ones, that didn't quite add up. The way he handled phone calls, stepping outside, voice low but confident. The way people spoke to him when they thought I wasn't listening. Respectful, careful, like they knew something I didn't. I ignored it at first. I told myself I was overthinking. After all, my father had made it very clear what he thought of my husband.
He is nothing, he had said.
But 6 months later, sitting across from that same man he dismissed, watching my father's hands tighten slightly as he asked for help, I realized something that changed everything. My husband didn't have nothing. He had just never needed to prove anything to anyone. And my father was about to learn that the hard way. I thought the hardest part was over once I said, I do. I was wrong. The real silence did not happen at the wedding. It settled in afterward, in the small apartment where every sound echoed a little too loudly. The refrigerator humming, the traffic outside, the soft click of the front door when Daniel left early in the morning and returned late at night. Our place was just under 600 square feet, with thin walls and a window that looked out at a brick building less than 10 feet away. It was nothing like the glass walls and skyline views I had grown up with, but Daniel never treated it like something temporary or beneath him. He moved through that space like it was exactly where he wanted to be. He would make coffee every morning without fail, measuring everything precisely, like even the smallest routine deserved care. He fixed a loose cabinet hinge on our second day there, even though I told him it did not matter. It does, he said quietly. Little things always do. I started to notice how consistent he was. Not just kind, but steady. The kind of steady that does not break under pressure. Meanwhile, I was still learning how to exist without everything I had once taken for granted. I learned how to check prices at the grocery store. I learned how to stretch a meal across 2 days. I learned how to sit with the absence of a phone that no longer rang with invitations or expectations. And yet, I did not feel abandoned. Not completely. Because Daniel filled the silence in ways that did not draw attention to themselves. He never asked me to adjust. He simply adjusted with me. Still, there were moments that lingered in the back of my mind. Small, quiet moments that did not fit the version of him my father had so confidently dismissed. One evening his phone rang. While he was in the shower, I glanced at the screen without thinking. The name displayed was not saved, just a number, but the message preview caught my attention. The board approved your terms. Awaiting confirmation. I stared at it longer than I should have, then quickly set the phone back exactly where it had been. When Daniel came out, he did not mention it. Not that night. Not ever. Another time, we were at a small diner a few blocks away, the kind with laminated menus and coffee that never seemed to run out. The waiter brought our check and hesitated for just a second longer than necessary when handing it to Daniel. There was recognition in his eyes. Not the kind you give a regular customer, but something sharper. More aware. Daniel thanked him like nothing was unusual, paid in cash, and left a tip that was generous, but not excessive. Just enough to be noticed, not enough to be questioned. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was still adjusting, still trying to make sense of a life that no longer followed the rules I had always known. My father's voice echoed in my mind more often than I wanted to admit. He has nothing. It had sounded so certain, so final. But as the weeks passed, I began to realize something unsettling. Daniel did not act like a man who had nothing. He acted like a man who had already chosen what to keep and what to leave behind. And that difference was starting to matter more than I was ready to admit. By the third month, the silence in our apartment no longer felt empty. It felt intentional, like something was being built inside it, piece by piece, without noise or announcement. I started to pay closer attention, not because I distrusted Daniel, but because the world around him did not behave the way I expected it to. One afternoon, I came home earlier than usual. The door was slightly open, just enough to let me hear his voice from the living room. It was calm, measured, and completely different from the quiet tone he used with me. "No, do not move forward yet," he said. "Wait until the numbers stabilize. Then we renegotiate." There was a pause, and I could almost feel the weight of whoever was on the other end listening.
Carefully.
I said wait, he repeated, still calm, but firmer this time. I stepped inside quietly, not wanting to interrupt, but the moment he saw me, something shifted. Not panic, not guilt, just a subtle change, like a door closing softly. "I will call you back," he said, and ended the call, without another word. For a second, we just looked at each other. I expected an explanation. He did not offer one. Instead, he gave me a small smile, the same one he always gave me, warm and steady, as if nothing had happened. "You are home early," he said. I nodded, setting my bag down, pretending that I had not just heard something that did not fit the life we were living. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, replaying that moment in my mind. The confidence in his voice. The authority. It was not the voice of a man struggling to get by. It was the voice of someone who was used to being listened to. A week later, another piece fell into place. We were walking through a bookstore downtown, the kind with polished wood floors and soft lighting. Daniel paused near the business section, scanning the shelves like he already knew exactly what he was looking for. A man in a tailored suit approached him, mid-conversation on his phone, then stopped abruptly. "Sir," he said, lowering the phone immediately. Not hey. Not excuse me.
Sir.
Daniel gave a slight nod. Nothing more.
No introduction.
No acknowledgement beyond that. The man stepped aside instantly, as if that small gesture had been enough. I felt it then, that quiet shift in the air. Not visible, not loud, but undeniable. Later, as we walked home, I finally asked the question that had been sitting at the edge of my thoughts for weeks. "Daniel," I said carefully, "what exactly do you do?" He glanced at me, just for a moment, then back at the road ahead. "I solve problems," he said. Simple.
Vague.
Final. I waited, thinking he might say more, but he did not. And somehow, that answer told me more than any explanation could have. Because it was not what he said. It was how he said it. Like a man who had never needed to justify his place in the world. Like a man who had nothing to prove. And for the first time since I left my old life behind, I began to understand something my father had completely missed. The difference between having nothing and choosing to show nothing at all. It happened on a Tuesday, just after dinner, when the first crack in my father's world finally reached our quiet little apartment. The television was on low volume, more for background noise than anything else. I was rinsing dishes in the sink when I heard his name. Richard Carter. The anchor's voice was calm, professional, But there was something beneath it. Something sharp. Carter Industries is facing unexpected financial pressure after a major deal collapsed earlier this week. I froze, my hands still under running water, listening as words like liquidity, investor concern, and internal restructuring filled the room. These were not words I had grown up hearing associated with my father. He was the man who closed deals, not the one who lost them. I turned off the water slowly and walked into the living room. Daniel was already watching, his expression unreadable, eyes focused but distant, like he was not just hearing the news, but measuring it. "Do you think it is serious?" I asked quietly. He did not answer right away. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, as if the details mattered more than the headline. "It depends," he said finally, "on how deep the problem actually goes." That was all.
No surprise.
No concern, just observation. Over the next few days, the story grew. Headlines shifted from cautious to urgent. Analysts began speculating. Former partners made statements that sounded supportive, but felt carefully distanced. I watched it unfold the way someone watches a storm from behind a window, knowing it is dangerous, but not yet sure if it will reach them. My phone, silent for months, suddenly felt heavier in my hand. I checked it more often than I wanted to admit, half expecting, half dreading that it might ring. It did not. Not at first. Instead, something else changed. Daniel became quieter, not withdrawn, but more focused. His calls were longer now, still taken outside, still low and controlled, but there was a precision to them that made everything else fade into the background. One night, I stepped onto the fire escape without thinking, the cool air brushing against my skin as I caught the tail end of one of his conversations.
"No, he will not have many options left," Daniel said.
"Not if the numbers continue this way." There was a pause, then a softer tone. "I am aware of the timeline." I stepped back inside before he could see me, my heart beating a little faster than it should have. I did not know exactly what was happening anymore, but I knew this was no coincidence. My father's world was shifting. And somehow, quietly, without ever saying it out loud, Daniel already seemed to be standing exactly where that shift would land. Then, 6 days after the first news report, my phone finally rang. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. The name displayed was one I had not seen since the day of my wedding. Richard Carter. My father. I let it ring once more before picking up, steadying my voice the way I had learned to do over the past months. "Hello." There was a pause on the other end, longer than I expected. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Not weak, not broken, but stripped of something it had always carried before.
Certainty.
"Emily," he said carefully, "I need to speak with your husband." The room felt smaller after that call, like the walls had shifted just enough to make everything tighter, harder to breathe in. I kept my phone in my hand for a few seconds after the line went silent, staring at nothing, replaying his voice in my head. Not the words, but the tone. My father had never asked for anything in his life. He expected. He demanded. He decided. But this was different. "He needs to speak with your husband. Not with me. Not even about me. With Daniel." I turned slowly toward him. He was still sitting on the couch, the television now muted, his posture unchanged, as if he had already been waiting for this moment long before it arrived. "It was him," I said quietly. Daniel nodded once, like he had expected nothing else. "What did he say?" he asked. I hesitated, not because I did not want to tell him, but because saying it out loud made it real in a way I was not fully prepared for. "He wants to talk to you," I said. "About business, I think." There was a brief silence, the kind that carries more weight than any immediate response. Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze lowering for just a second, as if he was aligning something in his mind. Not surprised. Not curious. Just calculating. "I see," he said. That was all. No questions. No reaction that matched the significance of what had just happened. I felt something shift inside me then, not confusion anymore, but clarity beginning to form. Because a man who has nothing does not respond like that when a billionaire CEO suddenly asks to meet him. I sat down across from him, my hands folded tightly in my lap, searching his face for something familiar, something I could hold on to. "Daniel," I said carefully, "what is going on?" He looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment I thought he might finally explain everything. But instead, he reached for my hand, just like he had on our wedding day, steady and warm. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said softly. The same words, the same calm, but this time they felt different. Not dismissive, protective, as if whatever this was, he had already decided to carry it himself. The next morning, everything moved quietly, but deliberately. Daniel left earlier than usual, dressed no differently than he always was, simple, clean, unremarkable. But there was something in the way he moved that made me pause. Focused. Certain. Like a man stepping into a role he had not played in a while, but had never forgotten. I spent the day alone, the hours stretching longer than they should have, every small sound pulling my attention back to the door, to the clock, to my phone. And then, in the early afternoon, it happened again. A notification. Not a call this time, but a headline. Carter Industries enters emergency negotiations with unidentified private investor. I read it twice. Then a third time. Unidentified. Private. My chest tightened slightly, not from fear, but from the slow, undeniable realization of what I was starting to understand. When Daniel finally came home that evening, he did not say anything right away. He took off his jacket, set his keys down, and walked into the kitchen like it was any other day. But I could see it now. The difference. Not in what he did, but in what he did not need to say. "You met with him," I said quietly. He paused for just a fraction of a second, then turned to look at me. And for the first time since all of this began, there was something new in his eyes. Not hidden, not distant, clear. "Yes," he said. And in that single word I knew, whatever was about to happen next, my father was no longer the one in control. The next few days moved differently, like time itself had slowed down just enough for every detail to matter. Daniel did not explain what happened in that meeting, and I did not push him. Not because I was not curious, but because I was beginning to understand that whatever he was doing, it was deliberate. Precise. The kind of precision that does not leave room for unnecessary words. But the world outside did not stay quiet. News about my father's company spread faster now, no longer cautious, no longer speculative. The headlines were sharper, more direct. Critical liquidity gap. Leadership under pressure.
Urgent restructuring d'Airway.
These were not rumors anymore. These were facts. And with each passing day, one detail kept repeating itself across different sources, different analysts, different interviews. A private investor had stepped in. Not publicly, not officially, but enough to stop the fall. Enough to keep everything from collapsing completely. I sat at the small kitchen table that evening, my phone in front of me, reading the same line over and over again. Private investor. Unnamed. Strategic control under negotiation. The words felt cold, distant, like they belonged to a world I had once lived in but no longer fully understood. "You already know, do not you?" I said quietly when Daniel walked in. He stopped for a moment, just inside the doorway, like he was deciding how much to say. Then he closed the door behind him and stepped forward. "I know enough," he replied. I studied his face, searching for something, confirmation, denial, anything that would make this clearer. "They're saying someone is stepping in," I continued. "Someone who now has leverage over everything." Daniel did not deny it. He did not confirm it either. He simply pulled out a chair and sat across from me, his hands resting calmly on the table. "And what do you think that means?" he asked. It was such a simple question, but it shifted everything. Because for the first time, he was not avoiding the conversation. He was guiding it. I took a slow breath, choosing my words carefully. "I think it means my father is no longer deciding the outcome," I said. "I think it means someone else is." There was a brief silence after that. Not uncomfortable, not tense, just clear. Daniel nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "That is usually how it works," he said. And in that moment, something inside me settled into place. Not the full truth, not yet, but enough of it to see the shape of what was happening. The next morning, everything became impossible to ignore. I woke up to a flood of notifications, messages from numbers I had not seen in months, all pointing to the same thing. A new report had been released overnight. Carter Industries enters formal negotiation phase with controlling investor. Controlling. That word stayed with me, because it meant more than involvement. It meant authority. It meant power had shifted, officially, even if the name behind it was still hidden. I looked up from my phone slowly, my eyes moving toward Daniel, who was standing by the window, watching the city like he had done countless times before. But now I could see it differently. Not as a man observing the world from the outside, but as someone who understood exactly how it moved. "When are you going to tell me?" I asked quietly. He turned then, meeting my gaze without hesitation. And for the first time since all of this began, there was no distance left in his expression.
No silence. No deflection.
Just truth, waiting at the edge of being spoken. Soon, he said. And somehow, I knew that when he did, nothing in my life would look the same again. He did not make me wait long. The next morning, Daniel told me to get ready, his voice calm, but leaving no room for questions. We drove downtown in silence, the city moving around us like it always did, busy and unaware, but everything felt different now, like I was seeing it from a place I had never stood before. When we stopped, I looked up and immediately recognized the building. Glass, steel, 28 floors, the kind of place where decisions are made that affect thousands of people at once. Carter Industries headquarters. My father's domain. Or, at least, it used to be. I turned to Daniel, searching his face for hesitation, for anything that might suggest this was uncertain, but there was none. He stepped out of the car like he had been there 100 times before, not as a visitor, not as someone asking for access, but as someone who belonged. Inside, everything felt familiar and distant at the same time. The marble floors, the quiet hum of conversations, the subtle tension in the air that always existed in places where power lived. But something had changed. People were not just moving with urgency. They were watching, waiting. And when Daniel walked past the front desk, no one stopped him. No one questioned him. The receptionist straightened slightly, her expression shifting from routine politeness to something more attentive, more aware. "Good morning, sir," she said. "Sir." Again. Not a question. Not a guess. Recognition. I felt it then, that final piece falling into place. We stepped into the elevator, the doors closing softly behind us, sealing us into a moment that felt heavier than anything that had come before. "Daniel," I said quietly, my voice steady despite everything. "What are we doing here?" He looked at me, not avoiding, not deflecting, just meeting my gaze fully. "You deserve to see it for yourself," he said. That was all. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, the atmosphere changed instantly. Quieter. Sharper. The kind of quiet that does not come from absence, but from control. We walked down the hallway, past offices I recognized, past people who once would have known me by name, but now looked at me with something closer to uncertainty. Not because they did not recognize me, but because they did not understand what was happening. At the end of the hall, outside the boardroom, 2 men in suits stood aside the moment Daniel approached, opening the door without a word. Inside, the room was already full. Executives, advisors, people who had spent years building their positions, now sitting still, waiting. And at the head of the table, my father, Richard Carter. He looked older than I remembered, not weaker, but worn in a way I had never seen before. His eyes moved to me first, surprise flickering for just a second, then to Daniel. And that was when everything shifted. Because for the first time in my life, my father did not speak first. He waited. The entire room did. Daniel stepped forward, calm, composed, his presence filling the space. Without effort, without force. And then, in a voice that was steady, controlled, and impossible to ignore, he said the words that changed everything. "Shall we begin?" No one spoke after that. Not immediately. The weight of those 3 words settled over the room like something tangible, something that could not be ignored or pushed aside. I stood just behind Daniel, close enough to feel the steadiness in him, the complete absence of hesitation, and for the first time, I understood that this was not new territory for him. This was where he had always belonged. My father leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers resting against the polished surface of the table, but I could see it now, the subtle shift in his posture. He was not leading this room anymore. He was waiting in it. Mr. Brooks, one of the executives began cautiously, his voice measured. We appreciate you taking the time. Daniel raised his hand just slightly, not rudely, not forcefully, but enough to stop the sentence before it could continue. The room fell silent again, even more completely this time. Let us be clear, Daniel said, his tone calm, controlled, leaving no room for interpretation. I am not here for appreciation. He stepped forward, placing a thin folder on the table, sliding it toward the center where everyone could see it, but no one moved to touch it. You are here because you no longer have leverage, he continued. There was no accusation in his voice.
No emotion.
Just fact. I watched my father carefully then, expecting resistance, expecting that familiar confidence to rise. But it did not. Instead, he nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging something he had already come to accept. And you believe you do? My father asked, his voice steady, but quieter than I had ever heard it before. Daniel met his gaze, without hesitation. I do not believe, he said. I know. The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled into the room with a finality that no one challenged. One of the advisors reached for the folder, opening it carefully, scanning the first page, then the next. I watched the shift happen in real time. The tightening of his jaw. The way his posture changed, leaning slightly forward, like the numbers in front of him demanded more attention than he was prepared to.
Give.
This is a controlling stake, he said slowly. Daniel did not respond. He did not need to. The room already understood. My father's eyes moved from the document back to Daniel, studying him now, not as an outsider, not as someone beneath him, but as an equal.
No, not even that.
As someone he needed. You have positioned yourself very carefully, my father said. It was not praise. It was recognition. Daniel inclined his head slightly. Carefully is the only way to position anything that matters, he replied. Another silence followed, but this one felt different. Not heavy, not uncertain, decided. I felt it in my chest, that quiet shift of everything I had known about power, about control, about what truly defines a person. My father looked down at the document again, then back at Daniel, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in his expression I had never witnessed before. Not anger, not pride, something else, something closer to humility. What are your terms? He asked. And in that moment, it was undeniable. The man who had once walked out of my wedding, convinced he had all the power in the world, was now sitting across from the man he had dismissed, asking for permission to move forward. The room did not move after that question. It waited. Every person at that table understood that whatever came next would not just decide the future of the company, but redefine who held the power inside it. Daniel did not answer immediately. He let the silence settle, not as a tactic, but as a space where the truth could exist without interruption. Then he stepped forward, resting his hand lightly on the back of the chair at the head of the table, not sitting in it, not claiming it, but standing close enough to make it clear that he could. My terms are simple, he said. His voice was calm, steady, the same voice I had heard in our small apartment, but now it carried through the room with a weight that no one questioned. The company continues. The employees remain. The structure changes. He glanced briefly at the executives, then back at my father. Control shifts where it is needed, not where it is inherited. No one interrupted. No one objected, because no one could. My father held his gaze, absorbing every word, not as a challenge, but as a reality he could no longer ignore. And me? He asked quietly. It was such a small question, but it carried everything inside it. Authority, identity, legacy. Daniel did not hesitate. You remain, he said. If you are willing to adapt. There was no cruelty in it.
No punishment.
Just a condition. My father exhaled slowly, his eyes lowering for just a moment before returning to Daniel. And if I am not, he asked. Daniel's expression did not change. Then the company still continues, he said. That was the difference. That was the shift. Not dominance. Not revenge. Independence. I felt something settle inside me then, something I had not realized I had been holding on to since the day of my wedding. Not anger. Not resentment. Expectation. The belief that one day, somehow, things would return to the way they were. But standing there, watching this moment unfold, I understood that nothing was going back. It was not supposed to. My father nodded slowly, the movement measured, deliberate, as if each second mattered. I understand, he said. And for the first time in my life, his voice carried something new. Not command. Not certainty. Respect. The meeting did not end with applause or relief. It ended with quiet agreement, signatures that would be formalized later, and a shift that everyone in that room would feel long after they walked out. As we left the building, the city looked the same as it always had, but I was not. I turned to Daniel, searching his face one more time. Not for answers now, but for something else. Why did you not tell me? I asked softly. He paused, just for a moment, then reached for my hand, the same steady gesture that had carried me through everything. Because I needed you to see it, he said. I nodded, understanding more than I could have put into words. Because now I did see it. Not the money, not the titles, but the difference between someone who builds power quietly and someone who believes they are entitled to it. And as we walked away, I did not look back, because I finally knew something my father had only just learned. Respect is not given by wealth. It is revealed by character.